Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Welcome to my room, and welcome to my video. Now, if we're going to be here, I need to lay down some ground rules first. First off, don't ask about the sunglasses, because I'm going to tell you. I'm wearing them because they're so cool, and because I don't want AI to have any more of my face than I already have probably given it. Will it help? I don't know, but it makes me feel better. Second ground rule, be nice to me. Please. Please be nice to me. There's other people that live in my house. So if you hear a background noise, no, you didn't. If you see the camera wobble, no, you didn't. If you hear me slip up on my words, no, you didn't. Just like clap, clap for me, okay? I'm a very brave boy. All right, with out of that, off to a great start. With that out of the way, content warnings for this video. We will be discussing fascism. We will be discussing transphobia. We will be discussing racism, control over people's bodies, systemic sexual abuse, basically. Just everything that comes with that. Eugenics, which, you know, we're going to be talking about Nazi shit here. So if you're not in the headspace for this, click off and take care of yourself. I love you. Oh, I can't do it by myself. I love you. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want you to do a thought experiment with me. And by that, I mean, I want you to remember where you were and what you felt after the 2024 presidential election. I was here in bed the morning after, and I didn't get up for hours. I just laid in the blanket tangle with my limbs all splayed out, and I just cried. It was that state of grief where nothing feels real. It feels like a bad dream that you can't wake up from, but you know it's it's real. When I discussed with my friends about how we were feeling, it was this shared sense of dread and mourning and fear, even though none of us really knew what to fully expect from a second Trump presidency. For me, I felt like I was just waiting. And I remember that winter knowing that things were never going to be the same again. It was the calm before the storm, that period between the election and the inauguration. And then that calm, tense bubble popped. And, and on Inauguration Day, President Donald Trump signed 28 executive orders, which was more than any other president this century has signed on his first day. It felt like a declaration of war against us, the regular American people who just wanted to live our lives and not die. As one of his first acts in his second term, he declared that there was male and female and nothing else. I'd wondered for a long time why people in positions of power seem to be so concerned with other people's genders. It never made sense to me the lengths people will go to just to ensure that people are living in their assigned gender roles. Like, don't you people have anything better to do? Why are you spending money you could put towards, like another car or a yacht or a trip to the Bahamas or whatever, towards attacking teachers that use kids' preferred names in school? It seemed like a waste of funds and a waste of energy. Besides just being plain, horrible, I didn't understand. And then when I started studying authoritarianism after the election, go figure, it started making more sense to me. Because authoritarianism is centered on enforcing the way people are allowed to live their lives, and gender is a deeply systematic way to enforce how a person is treated in life and what they're allowed to do. So when people start pushing back against gender and when we acknowledge that gender roles and gender itself aren't set in stone, that scares people who benefit from power. A society built on controlling other people is threatened in a very real way when those methods of control are threatened. We all know that it was never about the safety of women and kids. Because if it was, the Epstein files would have already been released. And if it was, The thought of confirming a child's sex just so they could play on a sports team never would have been entertained by anyone. From day one, the campaign against trans rights has been about societal control. To illustrate my point, I'm going to bring you to a time and place that has felt familiar to me ever since Trump started scapegoating immigrants for political sway. Welcome to the Weimar Republic. A little over 100 years ago, one of my personal heroes, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was an early pioneer of queer rights, had founded the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. It was more than just a research center. It was a place where all queer identities could be accepted and affirmed, because at the Institute, queerness wasn't pathological. It was just natural. It was who you were and how you existed in the world. And early HRT and sex change operations were available, and several individuals that today we would probably call trans women were employed at the Institute when they couldn't find employment elsewhere. But on May 6th, 1933, only a few months after Hitler came to power, the Institute was raided by the Nazis. I've linked an article about the Institute in the description, which includes a photograph of two young Nazis picking through the literature, because I don't think I can put this photograph up on this platform. The article's not too long, and if you're interested in learning more about the Institute, I definitely recommend reading it. So on May 10th, just a few days after the Institute was raided, tens of thousands of books were burned by the Nazis in Berlin. It was publicized, and among the books burned were texts from the Institute. But it wasn't possible to completely destroy every book, especially widely circulated texts like the work of Karl Marx. But if you can't completely destroy an idea, you can at least send a clear message that it is not welcome in the new order. The book burning was a statement and a threat more than anything else. Living in the age of the internet where information is freely available, I'm reminded of this. All the, relatively recently deleted information that has previously been available on government websites is still known and available elsewhere. Like, you can still type in a web search and find it. But that's not the point. Scrubbing history from government sites sends a very clear message about what you want your country to look like and just who isn't welcome in it. So, after making sure the country was as hostile as possible to those who didn't fit into the idea of the German folk, Adolf Hitler established the distinct roles that were to exist for German citizens under Nazism in a 1934 speech to the National Socialist Women's Organization, saying this: "We feel it is not appropriate when woman forces her way into man's world, into his territory. Instead, we perceive it as natural when these two worlds remain separate. One world is characterized by strength of feeling, strength of the soul. The other world is characterized by strength of vision, toughness, determination, and willingness to act. In the former case, this strength requires the willingness of woman to commit her life to preserve and increase the family unit. In the latter case, this power requires from man the readiness to provide security. Whatever sacrifices man makes in the struggle of his people, woman makes in the struggle for the preservation of her people and family units. What man offers in heroic courage on the battlefield, woman offers in ever-patient devotion, in ever-patient suffering and endurance. Each child that she brings into the world is a battle that she wages for the existence of her people. Both man and woman must therefore value and respect each other when they see that each accomplishes the task of nature and the task that nature and providence have ordained. Out of this separation of functions, there will necessarily come mutual respect." Excuse me while I wash my mouth out, because I have never before quoted Hitler at such length, and a soap would taste less disgusting than that did. One thing that we need to remember is that these strict gender roles were not universally applied to every person living in Germany. The Nazi regime was concerned with having a healthy, racially pure society, and it only took a pro-natalist stance when it came to their ideal German woman. Aryan, physically healthy, socially acceptable, valuing women's ability to create life was never about valuing women, but about valuing the product. Gisela Bock, a German historian who specializes in gender, has a great article that I've linked in the description about eugenics and sterilization in Nazi Germany and how the dimensions of race influenced the treatment of women under the Nazi regime. While abortions were criminalized and voluntary sterilization was prohibited for the idealized German woman, eugenic sterilizations were enforced. Any woman who didn't fit into the Nazis' ideal of womanhood was a target for forced sterilization, such as ethnic minorities, disabled and mentally ill individuals, and people who broke social norms by not working hard enough or having enough money. The concept of gender wasn't even applied to other races in the same way, as Bock writes that according to theoreticians of race and race hygiene, the difference and polarity between the sexes is fully developed only in the superior, the Nordic races. Among inferior races, including those of low hereditary value, the sexes are less differentiated, and thus heavy and cheap labor is good for both. Authoritarianism has always relied heavily on controlling bodies, for reasons put best by, and I'm not going to apologize for likely butchering her last name, as she was an avid Nazi, Lydia Gottschewski herself, asking, what is the good in creating a new state if it fails to create new human beings? This has always been the core around authoritarian control of bodies and sex. Heinrich Himmler, who came to power as the leader of the SS after the murder of his rival Ernst Röhm, an openly gay man, had this to say in answer to the "why can't you just mind your own business?" question. There are those homosexuals who take the view, what I do is my business, a purely private matter. However, all things which take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. The people which has many children has the candidature for world power and world domination. A people of good race which has too few children has a one-way ticket to the grave, for insignificance in 50 or 100 years, for burial in 250 years. Whole lot of good that did them. After the war, Germany was devastated, with around 7,060,000 civilian and military casualties, and was left with mostly women to pick up the shattered pieces of the nation. This was absolutely devastating for a country that had emphasized superiority and strict gender roles for so long. But after the collapse of the Nazi state, gender roles had to shift out of necessity. After all, someone had to dig homes out of the rubble of Berlin, even if those somebodies were women. Not to mention, the entire world had just watched Germany commit a genocide and make a simultaneous go at world domination, and most nations were very unhappy about that. So a new political strategy was in order, you know, to improve optics. Frank Biess, a German historian, wrote that after the war, many different groups in German society crafted tales of the past that tended to emphasize their suffering and generally neglected the various degrees of their passive tolerance or active complicity with the Nazi regime. In so doing, these groups supported their claims for material compensation from the West German welfare state. They also sought to reclaim a moral high ground as Hitler's victims, a position that they had lost as a result of their exposure as perpetrators by Allied prosecutions of Nazi crimes at Nuremberg and elsewhere. So, the German people had to separate themselves from their very recent Nazi past as fast as possible, which meant cementing their identity as victims. So in 1946, the term dystrophy was coined, a condition suffered by German prisoners of war returning from Soviet camps. Today, we would understand dystrophy as a mixture of post-traumatic stress disorder and malnutrition. Biess writes that contemporary observers noted that the endless space of the Russian landscape and the completely different way of life in the Soviet Union had shaped German POWs to such an extent that their nature and facial expressions have become Russian, and they had lost much of their actual humanity. Dystrophy literature thus indicated the extent of German POWs' victimization by ascribing to them the allegedly subhuman features of their former enemies on the Eastern Front. Not only that, but POWs in the Soviet Union were desexualized and thus returned from Soviet captivity as emasculated and infantilized sexual beings. These deficiencies, moreover, did not only concern the psyche, but extended to the very sexual characteristics of their bodies. In the first monograph on dystrophy, the psychotherapist Kurt Gauger described the dystrophic feminization of returnees' bodies, which had apparently assumed female shapes and features with pubic hair of the female type, as well as the first signs and sometimes fully developed forms of female breasts. Dystrophy literature thus indicated that the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht was followed by a complete emasculation of its former soldiers in Soviet captivity. Yikes! That is a lot to unpack. The perceived loss of German masculinity was linked to a perceived loss in German identity, emphasizing a narrative of victimhood that became a shield from persecution for the Nazis and their collaborators. The role of German men had previously been strong, militant, and expansionist, but after the collapse of the Nazi regime, the masculine role was no longer useful in this way. But rather, this masculine role was actively unhelpful, and so the role shifted to the role of the victim, serving a political purpose for the nation as a whole. Of course, that role eventually shifted as well, born from the need to rebuild Germany, especially in the uncertain years of the Cold War, and by the mid-1950s, the role of German POWs as victims had shifted to one of survivors. In a freshly denazified state, the idea of feminine or, traumatized men served a purpose, but it wasn't seen as sustainable for a nation. Men with dystrophy were seen as a literal sign of the collapse of the nation, the loss of national identity, and just unsustainable for rebuilding. Despite what they'd have you believe, denazification was never completed in Germany. Heide Fehrenbach, another German historian, has studied the treatment of the mothers of mixed-race babies born in Germany after the war and the treatment of the children themselves, and the results aren't great. There were a number of mixed-race babies born as a result of American occupation in Germany between German mothers and African American fathers, and both the mothers and children faced ostracization afterwards. Fehrenbach writes, in a period marked by fierce nonpartisan commitment to sexual and social normalization and the reversal of wartime dislocations of gender and familial relations, the mothers of interracial children were held up to public scrutiny as an unacceptable anti-norm, in large measure because their behavior was perceived as undermining both the principle of German paternity and post-war efforts to reconstitute viable post-war German masculine and national identities. In other words, interracial sexual activity was seen as actively harmful to the rebuilding of the nation. If you're interested in reading more about the perspective of one of these occupation babies, I highly recommend Ika Hugel-Marshall's memoir, Invisible Woman Growing Up Black in Germany. It's very poignant and informative, and it made me cry more than once. So, gender, family, our bodies. It's always been political, wrapped up in race and the nation and who is allowed or forced to reproduce. If these are the building blocks that make up a state, and if reproduction is the means for a nation to continue, then of course any deviation is seen as a threat to the existing structure. It's authoritarianism that never fully died. Authoritarianism we're seeing flare up again today. It's the reason why when feminists in the 70s in West Berlin pushed to end domestic violence, the movement was ultimately hijacked and shifted to patriarchally protecting poor, defenseless women instead of its original goal of changing the societal structures that keep women in patterns of domestic abuse, as Jane Freeland writes. In writing about the feminist movements in West Germany, Mira Ferre, sorry if I mispronounced her name, Mira, explains that the goal was autonomy, not to be given boons by a patriarchal Germany, but to have full control of one's own life. She writes that the analysis of German feminists of the 70s identified women's bodies as the means of reproduction essential to society, and thus a potential source of collective strength. But because women's power to bear children was actually controlled by men and the state, it was converted into seeming to be a deficiency and used as a justification for subordination, as if subordination were a result rather than a cause of women's weakness. Which feels familiar. It all feels very upsettingly familiar, especially how the arguments 50 years ago for safe abortion access are still the same now. There's a link in the description to a public appeal in 1971 to repeal Germany's anti-abortion laws, calling for an end to unsafe abortions and increased access to contraceptives and sex education. It all feels so familiar because the building blocks of control that form patriarchal societies are still in place. Freeland writes that in Germany, Post-war Reconstruction took on gendered dimensions as politicians and religious leaders saw the return to bourgeois, Christian, heteropatriarchal gender roles as a path to normality. That's all there ever has been to it. From Nazism emerging from the ashes of World War I, from West Germany emerging from the ashes of the Third Reich, to American authoritarianism rising from our crumbling economy and infrastructure, it's all a search of a sense of normality and stability. Because maybe, just maybe, if we can return to an imagined past where everything was great, then everything's going to be great. So, what do we do with all of this? Do we sit back and give up because the seep of authoritarianism was never really stamped out, and the gender gods in political offices won't stop telling us what to do with our bodies? I feel hopeless a lot of the time. But I don't think that giving in to that hopelessness is the right answer. We learn so we can understand, and that's the first step in fighting back. But I think we all need to acknowledge how terrifying things are, how fascism never really died, and how we're watching a modern revival unfolding right now. When Trump was reelected, I'd only just started experimenting with my gender. I had those moments I'd heard described to me by trans people, the ones where you're staring at a box on an online forum and you have to choose between male, female, and other. And I didn't know which one to choose. But there was an added layer of fear to it. If I chose anything besides female, was something going to happen to me? Was it safe to keep going down this road, or should I just be happy with being a woman? I mean, that was the safe option. I wanted to know if other people felt similarly, so I asked my friend, who's chosen to stay anonymous, and this is what he had to share with me. I was already closeted in my public life. The Trump administration made me more convinced that I should remain this way and put forth the greatest effort not to allow any written documentation of my trans identity to exist. That being said, I actually came out to more people as trans following the election. I came out to several people close to me. I think that I felt compelled to do so because of a few reasons that I didn't articulate or consciously realize at the time. Reflecting back, I was experiencing a lot of emotional stress and fear from knowing I was trans in this now increasingly dangerous environment for trans people, and I needed support from those I trusted during this time. I came out because I needed to communicate that I was struggling, and I had to explain why I was struggling. In particular, I felt the need to talk about my fear around the election with people, to know that we were afraid together, so that I wasn't crazy and alone for thinking we were witnessing a dangerous plummet into fascism. In this way, coming out also served as a method to achieve much needed trust and togetherness. Revealing this information about myself, along with my related fears, was an invitation for the person I trusted to relay their fears as well, which united us in shared concern about the future. When I think of Magnus Hirschfeld, I don't choose to think about the image of his institute being ransacked. I choose to think about this image instead: a costume party at the institute. It makes me smile and cry both at the same time, because I don't know how many of these people survived the years to come. But in this point of time, when this photo was taken, they were together. It's like a snapshot of any queer friend group that could exist now. I wish I could walk into that photo, smile and leave the human being with the peaceful closed eyes to their loving embrace, gush over the ball gown, tell Medusa she looks beautiful, feel at home with people like me. I wonder if they knew. I wonder if they knew then that in 100 years, someone like me would see this photo and feel so much hope at the simple fact that they existed. At the fact that I see them now, in the faces of every other queer person I know. Because the fascists can try, but they can never completely destroy us. The world is terrifying. I don't know what's going to happen next. And that's a feeling that's stuck with me since that November morning. There was one thing I clung to then. One message that got me out of bed, posted by a friend in a Discord server. Good morning, my friends. A reminder that you can't give up. You have already survived him once, and you will do it again. He wants to see you wiped off the face of the earth, or at the very least, too defeated and beaten down to fight. Don't do his job for him. No matter how bleak things get, remember that you will outlive him and never stop fighting. I was tired. I was scared. My eyes were still wet. And I got out of bed. If existing as trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming is dangerous under the current administration, that means it's also a danger to the administration. Things are terrifying, and they're going to be terrifying for a long time. But survival isn't about pretending nothing is wrong. It isn't about coming out to unsafe people. It is about keeping the you that is alive. The world still needs you as you are. Trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, whoever you are, it needs you. It needs trans women to prove that womanhood is about more than just the human beings someone can produce for an authoritarian state. No matter how loud the TERFs cry about it. It needs trans men to prove that masculinity is just a matter of knowing who you are, and when you know that, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. It needs non-binary and gender fluid and every single kind of genderqueer and gender non-conforming person that exists to prove that there is another way to live for all of us. None of us are free until all of us are free, and that means that we cannot enforce gender on ourselves and let ourselves be stamped out. The world still needs me, and it still needs you, and we all need each other. No matter what else you do, you cannot do the fascist's job for them. You are not allowed to give up. So what should we do? Do what you can, but I think most importantly, keep living. Maybe take a photo at a costume party. The world still needs you. It needs to know you exist. Fascists aren't gods, just people. And somewhere, some queer kid needs to see that it's possible to become a queer adult. The first thing you need to do to fight fascism is just to live. The first way to resist is to exist. So keep going. Fucking with gender and its roles isn't just badass, it's anti-fascist. Thanks for watching. I love you. Take care of yourself.